Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, are the Milwaukee Bucks back? Camille and I dig into some November numbers and the updated standings. What has stood out the most? It's not just the schedule, it's the play on both ends of the court. And we dig into those specific reasons. Plus, help may be on the way very, very soon. We get into all of that coming up next on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. Free and available wherever you get your podcasts, and now available in newsletter form. That's right. Your favorite podcast is available as a newsletter. We introduced the Locked On Bucks daily newsletter, the one stop for ultimate team and league coverage delivered right to your inbox. Sign up for free now at lockedondaily.com. That is lockedondaily.com, and start your day with the all new and free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Camille, over the weekend, and Frank and I did a bonus lengthy post-game podcast. And after the Pacers win on Friday night, I think that was one that we all circled and we're like, I hope there's a good showing in this, just because of everything that went down last year, and saying this team feels improved and on the right track. And they delivered all of that on Friday night. They delivered most of that on Saturday too. And I think if we look at these two wins, we'll take a look at the recent stretch of play overall, but sticking with the two weekend games, you know, it was a wire-to-wire win against the Pacers. It wasn't a wire-to-wire win against the Hornets. You trailed in the first half, but I think the margin was never higher than 2 against Charlotte. And that's one of the things that has stood out to me the most in these last 3 or so games is, you know, there's always going to be runs in a game, but in the past, these runs where the Bucks are up 14, you walk away from the TV or the radio and you look back and you say, how are they losing by 8? Only 3 minutes has passed. And that's the stuff that they've slowly started to clean up. I mean, I don't think you can say truly they were in control against the Hornets, but I was never really concerned until the final 40 seconds of that game.
Yeah, the final 40 were crazy. I mean, the second half of that Hornets game was crazy to see LaMelo score 40 in the second half alone, when his
a career high for points in a half. Yeah, not just for the game.
Like, his prior career high was 38, and he scored 40 in the second half alone. Like, after the first half of play, I was like, man, the Bucks have been doing a really good job on LaMelo. I think at one point he was like 3 of 13 from the field in the first half. Yeah. Everything was looking really difficult for him, and then he just caught fire in that second half, and it did not seem as if no matter what the Bucks were throwing at him, he was knocking down difficult shots. He was just in his bag. And then Brandon Miller joined in on him, or in with it in the fourth quarter, where the two of them scored every single Hornets point in the fourth quarter. But with that, like, my favorite basketball phrase for the longest time has always been just, basketball is a game of runs. You know they're going to come. How do you withstand it? And then can you respond to it? And then I think of Dame talking about the fact that in this NBA, a 20-point lead isn't really safe anymore, given the pace of the game and how many threes teams get up. Like, you can lose a 20-point lead very, very quickly. And for this team to have that lead threatened, but still find a way to respond, was encouraging for me in this situation, in this game against the Hornets in particular. But this is a game where you saw, like, the ball sticking a little bit against Charlotte. They found a way to win, though. They just kind of leaned on the back of what Giannis and Dame could create in this game, and they went off from there. But to your point about just the improved play, if this game would have happened 3 weeks ago, I don't think I would have been as cool and calm throughout that second half of, like, you guys got it, you'll figure things out, as I was during this game against the Hornets.
Yeah, I mean, 3 weeks ago, if this would have happened even 10 days ago, it probably still would have been pretty stress inducing. Um, I know Doc Rivers has joked about it that it's actually a 7-game win streak here, but you're 6-1 in your last 7 games. Those wins that I'm sure everybody's going to push back to kind of take the air out of the balloon. The Raptors, the Pistons, the Rockets, the Bulls, the Pacers, and the Hornets. Look, you can only play who's on the schedule in front of you. And these, frankly, are all games that have given the Bucks troubles in the past. That's something you and I were talking about before we started recording here is, yeah, I mean, they look a lot better. I'm sure the conversation is going to come of, great, you're beating nobodies. And, there is a degree of truth to that. The Rockets win was a very, very good win.
Mhm.
How that team continues to look, and the fact that you were able to muddy it up and play a defensive game with them and win a defensive game. The Pistons, the Hornets, the Pacers, Pistons maybe not so much, but the Hornets and Pacers are teams that have given the Bucks troubles of
Yeah.
late. So to be able to win those games, dictate the pace and control things the way they did, I think is a major step forward. The Pistons, you've won the games, but the last year it's been closer than you would have hoped. So I think that's another strong sign as well. And getting that lick back, as James said, against the Bulls with the way that you played in the second half, changing things there too. These are important wins. And I think the other important thing for this team, we said it at the time of the 2-8 start, is, as you look at what's in front of them, you
Mhm.
had, and everybody pointed to this upcoming schedule. After that Celtics game, here's what you got for all these teams. You close out the month with the Heat on the road and the Wizards at home, the worst team in the league, the Washington Wizards. In the month of December, we don't know the full picture yet because of the NBA Cup. If the Bucks are in the quarterfinals, the knockout round, that's going to change things. If not, you have 2 additional games that are scheduled with teams that missed the knockout round. That could be the Wizards and the Hornets again, teams like that. It could be very strong teams. It could be a team like the New York Knicks if they don't qualify, or the Celtics if they're not in there. So that's the wait and see part. But for the month of December, I think it's a similar conversation of, guys, you've started to really adjust things, correct things here. And in December, you have another favorable schedule on paper.
Mhm.
Maybe not with home games on the home road split, just 4 that you'll play with the knockout round games or the non-cup games. But you've got a lot of those opponents still, like the
Mhm.
Pistons are on there, the Brooklyn Nets, 2 more games with the Bulls, 2 with the Nets, I should say. The Pacers on a New Year's Eve matinee game. You do have 2 games with the Cavs and the Celtics, but the Hawks, the Wizards, like, these are games and these are opportunities for the Bucks to, now it's 7-5 in the month of November. You could finish with a very strong record in November, and you could look at December and say, look, with that schedule, we feel like at worst we should be 8-4, somewhere around there. And if that's the case, you all of a sudden look at things where you go into the new calendar year saying, man, the Bucks are, after a 2-8 start, let's say you go 8-4, and let's say you, best case scenario, you finish this month 9-5, 17-9 over the course of those 2 months after a 2-8 start, and part of that is included in there. I mean, that's the turnaround that you needed to see to not give yourself hope, but just to start getting things moving in the right direction.
It's the turnaround you want to see, especially against the competition. And I think sometimes with this Bucks team, especially if you weren't watching them closely over the last year or so, the games against those quote unquote lesser opponents were the ones that sometimes the Bucks did not come into the game with the proper energy, proper effort, and proper focus. And those were the games where they would lose, and you would look back and be like, how did you lose this game? Which is why earlier in the season, when you had the back-to-back losses against Chicago and then Brooklyn, it was one of those things where you're like, wait, are we going to do this again where we're overlooking opponents? I wasn't worried about the Bucks coming out with the right effort and focus against Cleveland, against Boston, because the Bucks have historically gotten up for good competition for those big games. It's those other games where attention to detail can sometimes lack. So for this Bucks team to have the stretch they just had, beating Chicago, getting their lick back, Indiana, Charlotte, Detroit, Toronto, I want to see them continue doing that over the next few games as well. Like once you get back to Boston on December 6th, I know the Bucks are going to be looking to come out and play the way they need to play, but it's those games against Washington and Detroit and Atlanta where it's like, don't take your foot off the gas. And if this Bucks team can go through those games and collect those wins as well, that's telling me a lot about just the psyche of this team and how locked in they are, because last year, that's something that was lacking with this team at times.
Yeah. I did the quick math in my head, and if you can be 18-13, 17-14, one of those two as we start the new year, that is an impressive job of the turnaround here. I mean, you may look at it on the surface and say, well, 4 games, 5 games above 500, 2 months into the season, but from a 2-8 start to that point, and again, with the way the Eastern Conference looks, you may not only be really steering things in the right direction, but you may be adding separation between yourself and some of those teams that are down there in that 7 and lower range. So we'll take a closer look at that standings. You mentioned the way they want to be playing, the way they have been playing, and especially going into that next Celtics game, which is suddenly just 10 days away or so. I do want to take a look at some of the reasons for this turnaround. There's not one specifically. We had a chance to ask Bobby Portis about that on the post-game show on Saturday night, and he gave a very, very long, thoughtful answer to that. So I do want to get into that discussion coming up next year on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at Skims. And look, we've all been there. Maybe you were a boxers guy before and you made the switch. But when you found out that Skims is now making men's underwear, it was a breakthrough, I think, for a lot of us. Maybe you have a favorite pair of underwear, but the fit has changed. They're not around anymore. You always have those questions of what style do I want? What material do I want? Once you put on your first pair of Skims, you know that's the pair that you want. There's no going back. They're sleek, lightweight, and super comfortable. It almost feels like you're wearing nothing at all, but you're kept fully secure where it matters most. When it comes to underwear, I think we've all tried them all, and Skims is the best to do it. Shop Skims Men's at skims.com/lockedonnba. Let them know we sent you. After you place your order, select podcast in the survey and select our show in the drop-down menu that follows. If you're looking for the perfect gifts for the whole family, Skims just launched their biggest holiday shop ever, also available at skims.com/lockedonnba. So again, get your pair of Skims at skims.com/lockedonnba and let them know we sent you. Select podcast in the survey in the drop-down menu that follows. All right. After the win against the Hornets, so whenever the Bucks win, we get a post-game guest. And it is, I should start keeping track of this. It is very commonly, we do get Bobby Portis a lot. We used to get Pat Connaughton quite a bit. I don't think we've ever had Brook Lopez. We have had Giannis once. I think we've had Damian Lillard once. And the past few games, we had Gary Trent Jr. talking about breaking out of the shooting slump. We've had AJ Green a number of times. Bobby Portis is always, and this is no surprise to you or anybody that follows the Bucks, Camille, Bobby Portis is always arguably the best interview that we get because not only of his engaging personality, Bobby Portis is very transparent and very candid and gives you answers that aren't cliche. And all right, let's blow through this interview. So last night, we typically get 3 questions with the players. It's meant to be quick. And I asked Bobby, I know it's a lot of things, Bobby, but what do you think is the biggest reason for this turnaround and this play that we've seen from this group here? Mentioning Doc Rivers, his belief in this team all along and saying the run is coming. It was early. And I think Bobby gave us a 4-minute answer. And those interviews are typically 2 minutes total at most. But his point was, and it's something that you and I talked about earlier in the season too. He specifically mentioned, look, these things happen. If we go 2-8 through 10 games or start 1-4 like we did, and you have that stretch, if we do that in March, nobody's really talking about it. It's our first 8 games, our first 10 games. That's what brought out a lot of this. But, we never lost faith in ourselves. These were the best vibes in training camp in the entire time that I've been on this team, and that includes a team coming off a championship. Best vibes around there. We all felt really good. We knew what to expect from Doc. We loved that Darvin Ham was back. All the coaching staff that we had that familiarity with, we were in a very good place. We were surprised by the results, but in film review, we knew why it was happening, and we went to work to correct it. And just talked about the contributions from the young guys, the role players that are in there as well, what they've done to really lift this team. But I think, the two big takeaways that I had were what we mentioned about, these things happen. And we should get this out of the way too. I think Frank and I mentioned this after the Friday night game. It's going to happen again in all likelihood. There's going to be a 1-5 stretch or a 1-7 stretch to come yet this season. But there's more attention on it when it's your first handful of games of the season. But the vibes piece that Bobby was talking about, he didn't go into specific detail of it, but I know others have mentioned it at times too. I think, and I'm going to say this in Duck, I think Doc Rivers has been very important for this team. And look, I get the Doc Rivers history in the playoffs. I mean, it's factual. You can't hide from that. This isn't even it's not just the coach that's on. I mean, that is true, but I get it. But I think Doc Rivers has maybe not outwardly said this, but he's hinted at it. This is the ideal group for me. There's not a lot of drama. I don't have to worry about egos and personalities and infighting. And you look no further than the team that Doc Rivers last and dealing with that. You look at everything that he dealt with the Clippers, which wasn't necessarily player driven. There were much bigger things outside of that. But just in terms of the makeup of this group being a veteran team and one that seems like we're a go along to get along type of group and nobody's going to rock the boat, that seems perfect for Doc Rivers. And I think the most important part of all of it is the message that we continue to hear from Doc early in the season, what Bobby kind of echoed too, that they never hung their heads. They never wavered. They never started to point the finger and really let things spiral, even with that start, that you had that singular message and approach from Doc Rivers of it's going to get better. We believe it. We believe what we're seeing. Haven't had Khris Middleton on the floor yet. I like this group. I know it's going to work. We're not concerned. That can go a long way. I mean, there are times when that message cannot be delivered. And it's, look, we've seen too much of this. We have to really start to dig into root causes here. But 10 games was not the time. And to have that message, not that I think the Bucks really needed it, but I think that was important to just reinforce the general picture, the grand scheme of things, where this group was at and what was still in front of them.
The fact that the locker room never lost itself, they, to your point, never pointed fingers, but yet and still there was accountability amongst all the players. So it wasn't finger pointing of like, it's just you doing this, but rather like, we're seeing this on film. This is what we need to correct. And hearing Doc talk about how he's trying to empower the players to call out when things aren't going right, saying, hey, you need to pass the ball one more time, or you were late on your switch, whatever the communication might be, empowering the players to be comfortable and holding one another accountable, because it's out of love. It's like, we are in this together. We are trying to be the best team that we can be. So we have to hold each other accountable in the process. And even Giannis post game after the Hornets, he mentioned the fact, like, in this locker room, no one's really hanging their heads. He was asked about how, Pat Connaughton was in the lineup, but now he's out, how DeLon Wright was out, but now he's in, and just how can guys continue to stay ready and be, in the game once they check in. And Giannis mentioned the point of like, they don't see their superstars complaining. Like, I'm not complaining about being called out or telling I need to be done better with this. Dame's not in that same mindset either. So like, if we're not complaining, how can anyone else complain? Like, we set the tone here and we know that we have to be accountable to reach our goals. So the locker room never wavered. And I think a lot of that comes from Doc being able to instill his culture, but also having two superstars on your team who want to be coached, who want to be better, and who aren't going to shy away from that, because they do help set the culture in that locker room and everyone else sees it. We heard Andre mentioned the fact of like, hey, I want to make sure I'm the hardest working. I can't not be the hardest working guy when I'm not a star. Like, I need to do better. And then seeing Giannis in the gym at all hours, seeing Dame, seeing Gary Trent Jr., who was somebody this offseason held as a really big pickup for this team, lose his starting role, come off the bench, and start to thrive in that role all the time that he's been putting in. And now you're seeing some of the results pay off for him of adjusting to the new role, understanding his place a bit better, and now it's showing up. And that part of the locker room is what really encouraged me during that 2-1 start of not hearing anything of like, guys are starting to lose or they're not believing, not hearing the things out of the Bucks locker room that we've been hearing recently coming out of Phillies. You know what I mean? Like, that means something for the construction of this team and going forward. So I love the accountability. And I mentioned it before, I think Doc is the right coach for this particular team at this time. Yeah. His ability to communicate and to clearly define roles, I think, is really good for this squad. Just everybody has that accountability aspect to it. So right now, seeing them come out of that 2-8 start, seeing how they've been playing in the month of November so far, like, it's encouraging. And I think that they have the right mentality in that locker room to continue to grow and do some big things this season.
One thing I want to get to off of that, of just something I observed at the game Saturday night between Doc and some of his players, but also you're telling me it's a good thing that Giannis has been I'm just going to lead by example and be more vocal this year, opposed to I don't know who said this, but I'm going to find him and that type of leadership, or even I was late, but it was really only 2 or 3 times. Like,
right. No excuses. No excuses.
But yeah, there was one thing I saw that kind of backs up everything that you said about Doc Rivers being the right guy at this time for this group, and the accountability piece and just his connection with players. So we'll get into that conversation and the potential very good news that may be just around the corner for this Bucks team. We'll dig into that next on Locked On Bucks. Let us first talk to you about our friends over at FanDuel. We're all ready to tackle NFL action, and now you can do so with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports book partner of the NFL. Talk to you about our friends at Game Time quite a bit. They're the best ticket app out there on the market. It's not just for sports, comedy, concert, theater, you name it, whatever you need. Game Time is the app to use to get those tickets. It's easy to use. It has a great interface, and it answers all of your questions within the app. Maybe you're traveling, taking in an NBA game or a college football game, going to see a concert. You want to see what the view is going to be like from that seat. If you've never been in that venue before, you can see a panoramic view of where your seats are going to be, what the view is going to be, all within the app. Toggle on the all-in pricing feature, and it shows the total upfront cost with no surprise fees at checkout, and you get the lowest price guaranteed, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. Best of all, your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time Picks. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So there was a moment to kind of back up Doc Rivers and his impact with this team too. We had the conversation towards the end of the Bud years about, do you need a former player as a coach? I don't think the answer is necessarily yes, but it did seem like what we were starting to hear, that was part of the voice kind of losing its message, and Bobby Portis specifically mentioning the loss of Darvin Ham. Like, you need the right mix of guys where you can lean on an assistant or somebody that has been through those battles as a player and still get the message from the head coach and vice versa. Doc Rivers brings that as a former player, as an experienced coach, as a coach that has won a championship with an incredibly experienced staff. And by the way, I think we are starting to really see the blueprint of Greg Buckner on this defense now. In the month of November, it's 12 games worth of data that we have seen a much, much different team, a top 10 level defense for the Bucks. I do want to get to a couple of defensive numbers in a second here, but that one thing that I was referring to, Camille, there was a point in that game yesterday in the fourth quarter where the Hornets, I think it was when they got it down to 6, because I remember there was the 13-point lead, and you felt good, but you were like, well, this was just 20.
A lot of time still.
Yeah, it was just 20 a minute ago, and this is still a lot of time. And the Hornets hit a 3. I think it was Brandon Miller hits a 3. It makes it 10. And then LaMelo Ball gets a layup, and then LaMelo Ball gets a 3. And it was a 5 or 6 point margin. The Bucks had a timeout. Coming out of the timeout, you could feel the tension in the building of what is happening right now. And the Bucks are coming out of their timeout, and it's starting to be a pretty high pressure situation. Damian Lillard's on the court, and Doc Rivers calls over to Dame for something, and Dame turns to talk to him, and you can see they're communicating about something defensively. And Dame is pointed out and turning to look at Doc and asking something. And Doc just has, his way of delivering things where it cleared something up, and then he says something else to Dame, and you can see Damian Lillard laughing immediately and making it, taking out all the seriousness of the situation. Things like that are important, where I'm delivering the message, but hey, man, like it's not quite as bad. And here's things where I can keep things light. And just Dame has talked about it before too, his respect for Doc Rivers, how they've connected over things like boxing and just things off the court. Doc, and how much you mentioned the name of Pat Connaughton, how much Doc Rivers has taken up for Pat Connaughton and said, still, yeah, I know it's 4 straight games now that he hasn't played. It doesn't mean he's out of the rotation. Things are going to happen, and we still need him, and he's a pro that's staying ready. Bobby Portis in saying we had to, play a limited amount of minutes, telling us about DeLon Wright wasn't good enough, and he wasn't in the rotation, but now he is. Like, there's a way to deliver that message and not lose the locker room, not lose the respect of those players. If you tiptoe around it, that's when it happens, when you're not being candid. And I think we know enough about Doc Rivers to know he is always going to be candid, but he is the type of person, we've all experienced this in life, that can deliver news you don't want to hear, or bad news, but he does it with a smile on his face and can immediately add lightness to the situation, where you don't leave thinking, man, I hate this guy, or what's this guy's deal and why doesn't he see this? Like, you immediately leave thinking, okay, I get why, and here's what I have to do going forward. And like you mentioned, I think those are some of the more important parts with this team, just seeing his connection with this group of players. And does it work with young guys? Maybe not. Does it work with guys that have egos? I don't think so. I mean, all these guys have egos, but to the extreme levels, no, I don't think it does. And I think we've seen that in the past. You have to have a group that is open to coaching and willing to accept that type of conversation, willing to have those difficult conversations. And that's what we've seen from this group.
Which, again, it's a good mix of a group. They have the right superstars for Doc Rivers, I think, as well. And to your point about Doc's ability to communicate, it makes me think about when JJ Redick was hired by the Lakers. And during his presser, someone was asking him about Doc Rivers. And we know how JJ Redick.
Well, we saw it again in Milwaukee too with JJ's commentary.
We know how he feels about Doc Rivers. And they asked JJ something like, well, what did you learn from Doc Rivers that you're going to take into your coaching career? Which I can imagine what was really going through JJ's head at that moment.
Yeah, I thought it was stunning that he said how to blow 3-1 leads.
He didn't go that route. But what he did say is just Doc's ability to communicate. He was like, he's a master communicator, and he has the ability to really bring a group together with a unified message and have you really playing for something bigger than yourself. He's like, and I will give Doc credit for that. Like, he's very good at that. So when you can get somebody to give you that type of credit when you know they don't really care for you too much, it goes again to say everything that we've been talking about here about Doc Rivers' ability to communicate with his players, to make things clear, which again is why I'm like, I've said it before, the everydayers are probably tired of hearing me say it, but had you told me when the Bucks fired Mike Budenholzer that Doc Rivers was going to be that coach to take them into the playoffs, I would have scoffed and said, like, we got that at home. Why are we doing this? I don't think this is the right move. But seeing him with this group and seeing just what he brings to it, like, I think he is the right guy at this moment for this team.
He talked yesterday, and we've turned this into the Doc Rivers episode, but he talked on Saturday too about time. And it just takes time for things to come together when he was asked about Giannis and Dame. And like, look, it's been a year and it's still not all the way there yet, but it's better because it's been a year that they've been able to work together and get to know each other and said, like, I mean, it's been a year for me with you guys. Like, I know what to expect from you guys. I know things about you guys now. And we've built that relationship and just seeing it. And look, this doesn't make a good coach, but when you talk about his ability to communicate and connect with people, you think back to the bubble when players didn't want to be there anymore and they had their internal meetings of let's boycott this and leave. Doc Rivers was the voice they sought out, and Doc Rivers was the guy that they went to. You think about all the connections that Doc has outside of sports. Larry David is one of his best friends in the world. Every single time Doc Rivers has his pregame press conference, part of this is he's been head coach for 25 years and played for multiple teams too, but every single road reporter, just about every team has a handful of road reporters that have some connection with Doc, and he immediately spots them. And before things start is cutting jokes with them and asking them how the family is and things like that. I've witnessed him this year, seen new faces of the media, people that are covering a handful of games that are starting to ask him questions. And you can see like, all right, good job. Nice question, where he leaves and walks off his presser and will pat that person on the back, where it's little things like that that make you feel like, man, this head coach knows who I am and likes me. Like, wow, that's cool. That's just the type of person he is. Again, it doesn't mean you're a good coach at X's and O's, but for where things were headed for this team and the vibes that we talked about last year, I mean, that's a big piece of this to the culture that you've heard so much talked about with this Bucks organization, of a best-in-class culture that they really started to cultivate here. It felt like that was slipping away a year ago, where you looked at the on-court performance, everything else, the mood and the vibes around this team, and you just thought, man, was it as simple as firing a head coach and making a trade that ruined all of this culture for us? And it's back now, with things like that, the accountability, Doc Rivers as the front-facing person of the organization now, and just the mindset of those players, that it has come to be a very good fit for this group. The playoffs are going to be a different story and something else to tackle. I get that, but I do start to get very sick of all the LOL Doc Rivers jokes and everything else that's out there. It's like we talked about before of the you can tell who you don't need to pay attention to in terms of Bucks analysis when they point to, the Bucks defense is still bad. Like, no, the defense has been nowhere near the issue for this team. It's been some other things. It's been the offense in figuring out some of those little things. I think it's the same with any Doc Rivers discourse. Like, when it comes back to the, what do you know? Doc Rivers' team gave up a lead or they blew this and that. Like, no, Doc Rivers is doing everything every single fan and every outside observer has asked for. He is coaching these games. Pat Connaughton's not playing. That's all we heard for years. And
why is Pat playing?
Yeah, why is Pat playing? You can play this guy. Well, he's doing that. Some of the other adjustments too, like we've seen a lot of offense defense changes for Doc Rivers. We've seen 2 games now where Damian Lillard wasn't on the floor for the final defensive possession of the game. So there's a lot of things that Doc Rivers takes criticism for that I think this year has been unfair if you're really watching and observing these games. Now, again, ultimately, it's going to come down to what happens in the playoffs. But for the time being, I don't see a lot of these complaints that we've heard.
You got to get to the playoffs first. Like, you got to make sure that the 82 games ahead of that, you got to make sure you put yourself in a position to get to the playoffs. And to your point about this has turned into a Doc Rivers episode, which we weren't expecting. We weren't expecting that coming into it. We wanted to talk about, the Bucks defense being top 10, offense and defense being top 10 in the month of November, talk about Khris Middleton, but that's going to have to wait for the Tuesday episode, because I think this is an important conversation to have around Doc Rivers. I love that you pointed out the offense for defensive subs. That's something I wrote in my notes of something that's been standing out to me watching Doc. And I know the Pat Connaughton on the bench thing probably happened a little too late for some Bucks fans, but I also love the fact that Doc gave his vets a chance. Hey, you have these minutes, you've earned them. How long can you keep them? We have guys in the background, and it makes me think of what he mentioned at Media Day, where he said he loved, or I think might have been when they brought in AJ and Tyler after the draft, actually, where I love the makeup of our team. We have the 6 returning vets. We have these young guys here, and then we have like these new vets on the team, and it's going to be a lot of push and pull between the vets and the young guys, and you need that on a roster. You need the vets to push the young guys, and you need the young guys to push the vets. The young guys because they want those vet minutes, and then the vets pushing the young guys like, this is how you be a professional. This is how you play. And it seems like this Bucks team has that right chemistry, and Doc is rewarding guys based on what they're doing on the court in training camp and rewarding them with those minutes. And I love to see that happening with them. But again, we're still early on in this season, but you're seeing this team start to get things together. You're seeing them walking in the right direction now. The process was looking better than the results for a part there, but now you're starting to see some of the results take place with the process in hand.
And even, the way he's used Ajax too, that it's not just, I think he deserves credit for that. And you can say, well, look at his defense. You have to play him. It's noticeable. I don't disagree, but we've also seen Doc and other coaches that still don't. Like, you're still going to lean on the vets. We saw it last year with Ajax. I think year 2 versus year 1 is a big difference there. But even things as simple as, all right, we're going to start Andre. We're going to ride him as basically our defensive horse and put him on the toughest assignment until we are forced to take him off for offensive reasons or something else. Like, we've seen that consistently from Doc Rivers versus just, well, the offense is still a very big problem, so we can't even play him. He's finding the right places to play this group together, and I think that's one of the more important things in this starting of a turnaround that we've seen from this group. The good news around the corner was Khris Middleton, as you mentioned. We'll get into that on Tuesday's show, because who knows, Camille, we may have official news on Khris Middleton by Tuesday. And, we've mentioned a little bit about the November performance. I've mentioned it a lot, mostly because in the early going, it was one good piece of news to cling to and keep projecting out there. But I think we'll get into what we saw in November probably next week, once the month is officially over and we have, look, here's what happened. There's a few trends that have held true for this team, but we'll see if that's the case after that game against the Wizards. Just 2 games this week, though, in Miami for the NBA Cup tomorrow night, and then the Wizards. And look, a 2-game week is welcome for the Bucks after 4 games in 6 or 7 days and another back-to-back. So you had to take care of business at home against lesser teams, and you did that. So now close out the month strong is what we're going to be looking for, that and potentially the return of Khris Middleton. We will be back once again tomorrow to dig into that Khris Middleton piece. When will we see him? What is it going to change for this team? What can we expect from him? And what is going to be the role for Khris Middleton? So we'll start to get into that conversation and take a larger look at the month as a whole as we move through the week. That will do it for today's show. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.